Our coalition is on the offensive. ISIL is on the defensive, and ISIL is going to lose. The resolution we've submitted today does not call for the deployment of U.S. ground combat forces to Iraq or Syria. It is not the authorization of another ground war, like Afghanistan or Iraq. I'm convinced that the United States should not get dragged back into another prolonged ground war in the Middle East. That's not in our national security interest, and it's not necessary for us to defeat ISIL.
President Obama today asking Congress to move quickly on an authorization for the use of military force against ISIS. This is some new Fox polls come out, including this one. Does the president have a clear strategy against defeating ISIS? 73% of those polled said no, he does not. And then how about the job the government's doing in reducing the threat of terrorism from Islamic extremists? You can see 67% only fair or poor. With that, let's bring in our panel. Jonah Goldberg, senior editor of National Review, Juan Williams, columnist with The Hill, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Jonah, what do you think of this AUMF ask and what the president has laid out?
I think Congressman Thornberry in your interview said it pretty much exactly right. He's trying to thread a political needle, not a strategic needle. A proper authorization of military force would say, we authorize the president to do anything he deems necessary to defeat ISIS. That's not what this thing is, and that's not what he's asking for. He's asking for all of these things that are political considerations. This no enduring ground troops strikes me as utterly bizarre unless you take into account the fact that he's very concerned about another crusade. You know, maybe it's to put limits so that Pope Urban doesn't declare the retaking of the Holy Lands. But beyond that, it is very strange. This is one area where the president is supposed to have maximum latitude. If he doesn't want to have a prolonged ground war, and I don't want to have a prolonged ground war, he says he doesn't want to have one, don't have a prolonged ground war. But why put yourself in handcuffs over this? And particularly at a moment where we're talking, where he's freaking out about Congress doing its duty about the Iran negotiations and talking about sanctions. He says it's outrageous for you to meddle there, but by all means create this Byzantine political document that constrains what I can do to fight an enemy of the United States.
By all accounts, Juan, I mean, Republicans, as you heard the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee say, have a problem with the way it's structured in limiting the attack against ISIS. Democrats so far have said it's too open-ended and it's too fuzzy. Right. I mean, it seems like it's going to have a tough time going across the finish line in Congress.
Well, you know, to me, this serves Congress's interest. I mean, this has been their habit. They never want to say, here is a license to go and fight a war. They are very reluctant to do that, Democrats and Republicans. I'm a little surprised at Jonah because essentially what Jonah's saying is, oh, the president should have a blank check. And I think, you know what? I think there are a lot of people, especially the Democrats, who would say, we're not giving you a blank check to go fight this war.
And some Republicans. Well,
but Speaker Boehner says, I haven't seen a strategy. Here I'm quoting the Speaker. I haven't seen a strategy to defeat ISIL. Well, he's not a soldier, he's not a general, and he's certainly not the commander-in-chief. So you would think if he was living up to Jonah's standard, he would say, okay, I'll say you can do whatever you want, I'll give you that authority. But he's not saying that. So I think you get into a situation here where Congress has been reluctant to give authority to any president, Republicans or Democrats, and yet they yell and scream.
Charles.
Look, the idea of a blank check, the way the Constitution is written, that's exactly what the Constitution envisions as war powers. Congress declares war, it gives a blank check, and the president, as commander-in-chief, executes the war. That's the only way to run a war. That's the reason it's done that way. This is the equivalent of a declaration of war, and yet the president constrains it in ways which is sort of a reflection of the way he's done all his so-called offensive operations. He said in his speech at the beginning, we are on the offensive, ISIL's on the defensive, and then he proposes here a strategy, although of course there are no details, in which he announces this is going to be for 3 years. Now, he doesn't have to withdraw in 3 years, but what is the purpose of putting a time limit on it in any way? It's exactly the way he announced the surge in Afghanistan, where the sentence after he announced the surge, he announced a date of America's withdrawal, and in fact he advanced that date as the election of 2012 approached. What you do is you say, we're going to fight the war. If you want an end date on it, You say until ISIS is defeated.
Right. I think there are some Republicans who don't have actually a problem with the sunset clause because they would have to renew the authorization. And in this proposal, the president has to come to Congress, or his administration does, every 6 months to update it. But, Jonah, I think the question is, does this tie the hands of the military as it's written now?
As a political document, it sure seems to. I mean, it basically, we don't know, because so many of these phrases have, as the congressman said earlier, have no basis in precedent. They are these fuzzy political terms. What is an enduring offensive engagement, or whatever these phrases are? And it basically sends the signal. I mean, look, a declaration of war is not a strategy document. I agree entirely with John Boehner. President Obama needs a strategy, and if his strategy is bad, Congress can still withhold funding for this or pay for funding for that. But if you believe that ISIS should be destroyed, and President Obama has said it should be destroyed, he should have authorization to try to destroy it. And he's still the commander-in-chief. If he doesn't want to engage prolonged ground troops, he doesn't have to. He's still in charge.
I want to put up these two quotes before we go to break. We're going to continue this discussion on the second panel. But first of all, the president to New Yorker back in January 2014 talking about ISIS. The analogy we use around here sometimes, and I think it's accurate, is if a JV team puts on a Lakers uniform, that doesn't make them Kobe Bryant, he said. And then he said, I think there's a distinction between the capacity and reach of a bin Laden and a network that's actively planning major terrorist plots against the homeland versus jihadists who are engaged in various local power struggles and disputes, often sectarian. Talking that week about Fallujah and those areas that were going down to ISIS in Iraq. In the AUMF, it's worded this way: whereas the terrorist organization that has referred to itself as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant and various other names in this resolution referred to ISIL poses a grave threat to the people and the territorial integrity of Iraq and Syria, regional stability, and the national security interests of the United States and its allies and partners. We have come a long way in 1 year and 1 month of this president's assessment of ISIS.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question. You know, they're not Al-Qaeda, I will say that, but I do agree that they pose a threat. The question is, it's a prospective threat in terms of their capacity to grow and become a threat to American national interest.
Grave here. More on this after a short break.